Well, we looked at some missionary activity in the northeast of the United States, looking at John Eliot and David Brainerd. But now we're going to take a quantum leap all the way out to the Pacific Northwest and look at some missionaries that may be new to some of you. I don't know if these pictures ring a bell with anyone, but this is a famous and in some ways infamous story of a missionary experience that was very much bittersweet. The name of the couple is Marcus and Narcissa Whitman, and it's quite a story. There's a lot of romance involved in this story as well, and so I want to kind of walk you through it and highlight some things. And again, we'll see another example of missionaries that seem to have the right intentions, the right focus, but then they lose that focus. Things become misdirected in the development of their work, and it results ultimately in disaster. Marcus Whitman was born in 1802, and he lived to 1847. So you can see he lived to be only 45 years old due to the disaster that overcame his household. He was an American, and he served in the Pacific Northwest. And of course, you can imagine at that period of time, this part of the country is largely undeveloped. Lewis and Clark took their famous trip to the Pacific Northwest in the early 1800s. And so the Whitmans really, in a sense, are following on the heels of that experience. So it is very much a daring pioneer work that they are undertaking. And for that, we give them credit. A lot of bravery, a lot of courage. You really have to be convinced that this is what God wants you to do in order to step out and do what they did. Now, as I said, romance becomes a part of the story. Well, you'll notice at the bottom right of your screen is the picture of another gentleman, and there is a bit of a rivalry going on between Whitman and Spalding is his name. And what happened was Brother Spalding had actually asked Narcissa's hand in marriage, and she had turned him down. And then sometime later, Whitman asked her hand in marriage, and she accepts. And so there is a built-in rivalry already between the two of them, even before things get started. And you might ask, well, what does that have to do with the outworking of their ministry? Well, it just so happens that the Spalding eventually got married and married a gal named Eliza. And when it came time to head out to the Pacific Northwest, both the Whitmans and the Spaldings ended up traveling together in the same train, the same wagon train. Now, you have to remember that in those days, you didn't just hop in your car and head out whenever you felt good and ready, because groups would have to travel together in fairly large numbers, and that offered protection from attacks and help along the way. You certainly didn't want to venture out on a trip of that magnitude all by yourself. And so the Spaldings and the Whitmans headed out together, and to complicate matters even more, they ended up sleeping in the same tent. Now, when I say tent, I'm not talking about a pup tent. I'm talking about a large tent that would have plenty of room. But nonetheless, here you have two couples that are recently married and two men who had both asked for Narcissa's hand in marriage. So, come on, these guys they're believers in the Lord Jesus Christ. They're transformed by the grace of God. They want to serve the Lord, but the fact of the matter is they're still dealing with the old nature. And what they did would not have been advisable. Now, again, I just want to remind you that circumstances being what they were, they didn't have a ton of choices in how to get this done. If one of them had said, we're going to travel now, and the other couple had said, we'll wait until the next wagon train, well, it may have been months before the next one was ready to go. And so they decided to travel together. And of course, it was a very, very tense somewhat precarious relationship. Now, they didn't end up actually serving in the same location. As we'll see on a map, the Whitmans went on farther into what is today the state of Washington, the area of Walla Walla, Washington, and the Spauldings remained back in what is today part of the state of Idaho. And so they didn't end up working in the same place, but they did make their trip out together. So it's quite a story, and again, you can read more of it to get get some more information on that. Now, the mission compound out in the Walla Walla, Washington area today, where the Whitmans went, was quite a big venture. They had quite an operation going there. And one of the things you need to understand is that trade was happening between the colonists and the Indians. And of course, a lot of pioneers were heading out that way, anxious to find their fortune in the vast acres of the Pacific Northwest. And so when the Whitmans began their missions work there, it quickly became more than just a missions work. In other words, the priority of evangelism and starting a church and ministering to the Native Americans there became somewhat overshadowed by so much business that needed to be cared for in order to keep this compound going. They had stores there. They had a medical facility because Whitman himself was a medical doctor. And again, this was a place where interaction took place between colonists and Indians. So you had trade routes intersecting there. It became quite a venture. And unfortunately, as can so easily happen in ministry, this venture and the complexity of it left missions and evangelism, church planting, somewhere in the background. And then to complicate the matters even more, the colonists brought out to the Pacific Northwest certain diseases that had previously been unknown to the Native Americans living in that region. And so their systems, their physical systems, weren't capable of resisting those diseases. And as a result, many of them got sick and died. And then slowly they began to accuse the white man of bringing his diseases out purposely to kill off the Native Americans so that the white man could take over their lands. And obviously, that was not the intent of Whitman. It may have been the intent of some of the colonists going out there, but certainly not of the Whitmans or of the Spauldings, for that matter. But nonetheless, it was an accusation they had to deal with. And then to complicate the matters even further, the particular tribe that was out in the region where the Whitmans was working was known to be a hostile tribe to begin with. So making friends and winning them and building rapport with them was a very, very difficult task. An impossible task? No, if you're following the Lord's direction wherever he calls you to serve, then nothing is impossible. But it appears that in all the activity that was going on, the Whitmans somehow kind of lost their focus, and their attention was diverted from the priority of missionary work that God had given to them. So what happens is eventually the Indian tribe becomes extremely upset, and kind of like what happened with King Philip's War back in the Northeast at the time of John Eliot. It reached a boiling point, and a couple of braves engineered a slaughter of the Whitman family. Both Marcus and Narcissa were slaughtered, as well as about a dozen other people. And of course, this hit the news back in the East, and the government wanted to send forces out to wipe out the Native Americans, and the thing just got really, really ugly. To what extent do you blame the Whitmans? That is really hard to say. As I've said before in these discussions, we need to be really careful that we don't just come down hard on them with the limited information that is available to us. We do not have all of the information that would help us to make a more accurate assessment of the situation. But the fact of the matter is, both of them lost their lives, as well as about a dozen others, and it basically closed down the mission ministry, at least in that location, and certainly would impact other efforts to come out. One of the things you have to keep in mind in any kind of ministry is that what you do in a particular location and how you do it is going to impact not only your specific ministry, but the ministry of others who may come out after you or work alongside you or nearby in another community. And so, what happened with the Whitmans did make it difficult for other missionaries to hit the Pacific Northwest and attempt to preach the gospel there. Now, as all of this is happening, Spalding actually finds himself back there in the Idaho area, in Lapwai, Idaho, experiencing a lot of success. The Indians there were coming to Christ. The Native Americans, I should say, were coming to Christ, and churches were started, and so he and his wife experienced some real fruit in their ministry. And so some historians have kind of held the two side by side, the Whitmans and the Spaldings, and they've asked the question, okay, in the final analysis, which one really had the better ministry? And the obvious answer, if you will, is the Spaldings, because of all the distractions and the final massacre that the Whitmans had to go through. But I would also like to say this to you, just as a good reminder. The way things appear to play out in ministry or in the Christian life here on earth, and the way that Christ sees them and evaluates them at the bema seat of Christ, the judgment seat of believers, may be two very, very different perspectives. The Bible does tell us that if we're faithful to the Lord, He'll give us fruit. But not always do things turn out the way we anticipate that they will. And so I'm not saying, go headstrong like the Whitmans did and, allow things to get out of control. But I also would caution you of simply assuming that their ministry was a complete failure, that there was nothing but loss, and it was a total waste of time. I have to believe that God, in His grace and mercy, did cause some good things to come out of that. If nothing else, this serves as a very good lesson for us. It's a caution for us. And I certainly would not doubt the sincerity of Marcus and Narcissa in seeking to reach the Native Americans for Christ. So, that's important to keep in mind. The year, as you can see, of the Whitman massacre was November of 1847, of course, the year that both Marcus and Narcissa lost their lives. Now, just pulling up a modern-day Google map, you can see the two locations. Lapwai, Idaho, and then on out to Walla Walla, Washington. And there is still to this day a National Historic Site commemorating the Whitman Massacre. And you can see that to drive that today would be, a little more than 2 hours. So you can imagine the distance in going by a stagecoach or by horse. And on the inset map there, you can see that the approximate locations. So, again, we're tempted to compare and to decide who's the winner and who's the loser or who's the better missionary. And I would caution you against that and say, God allowed this to happen in Walla Walla by His grace. He didn't allow it to happen in Lapwai, Idaho. And so, whatever God leads you to do, have a humble estimation of it and recognize the dangers, recognize the ease with which we can get distracted in ministry from the priorities that God has given us, and be watchful and prayerful as you seek to serve God and fulfill the task that He's committed to your trust.